I'd add to that point by, pointing out that if you chart gold price next to U.S. fiscal deficits as a percentage of GDP, that actually matches somewhat closely over the timeline of this chart. So you would have had really big deficits during the global financial crisis. Then they obviously cooled down a bit between that and COVID. Then they blew out in COVID. And then, we had this lull in, 2022 or so where the deficits cooled down and now they're reaccelerating again. And we see gold breaking out again. And so kind of my left curve, kind of low IQ take is that it's not, that the fiscal deficits are driving it to a significant degree, in addition to all the things that Luke mentioned around.
You know inflation has been raging, but what if we told you this is just the beginning? Renowned macro guru Lyn Alden drops a bombshell. We're headed for a full decade of soaring prices, unlike anything we've seen before. And here's the real kicker: the Fed's desperate rate hikes might be the last thing that can save us from this inflationary spiral. Alden explains why the fiscal floodgates have opened, rendering monetary policy virtually impotent. It's time to strap in for some harsh truths straight from the latest Lyn Alden interview. Get ready to have your economic worldview shattered as she unveils a new era of fiscal dominance that's about to turn everything you know upside down. Don't miss these jaw-dropping clips. Subscribe and slam that notification bell to catch Alden's masterclass on why the coming decade will be scorching hot for your wallet. The United States is entering a phase of fiscal dominance where the influence of fiscal policies overshadows that of monetary policies. This phenomenon arises when public debt levels become excessively high, rendering interest rate adjustments by central banks less effective in controlling inflation. Environment with high public debt, raising interest rates can paradoxically exacerbate inflationary pressures. The increased interest expense incurred by the government due to higher rates may outweigh the intended cooling effect on private sector borrowing and spending. Consequently, the fiscal stimulus resulting from the government's interest payments could potentially fuel further inflation, undermining the central bank's efforts to rein it in.
Just changing geopolitical views on, what you want as your reserve asset for kind of tail risk reasons. If you would have asked me a few years ago, would have I expected a divergence of this big? I would say probably not. And that's from someone who's long gold and not long duration treasuries. And yet I'm still surprised by the magnitude of divergence and the kind of the speed at which this correlation broke down. But I do think it's one of those ongoing signs of just fiscal dominance, where interest rates are no longer the decelerator that they are in an environment where there's less public debt. So when there's more public debt, interest rates have a much more mixed outcome of slowing down the economy than they do when you have low public debt and higher private debt or more money creation from the private side. Short answer is it's when fiscal matters a lot more than monetary policy, and it shapes what they can do with monetary policy. Basically, monetary policy becomes they're less independent, less able to control what they want to do because the fiscal side is such an ongoing issue for them. And the way I kind of characterize that is the difference between the 70s and the 40s. So those are both inflationary decades. When people think of inflation, they always think of the 70s, but the 40s were on average equally inflationary. And in the 70s, most of the money creation was from bank lending, right? So that was not in any way fiscal dominance. Even though we were running significant fiscal deficits, that was the smaller component. A lot of it was bank lending. So you had a very high money multiplier. You had kind of record sustained issuance of bank loans, largely because you had baby boomers entering the home buying years, for example, the kind of peak credit formation years. And so you had the surge in bank loans, surge in corporate bond issuance. A lot of this was private sector driven. And when they wanted to slow that down, because there's all this new money being created from fractional reserve lending, by raising interest rates, they could obviously harm borrowers. They could slow that process down pretty significantly. And even though that did increase federal interest expense, because federal debt to GDP was low, like 30%, it doesn't increase interest expense from the public side as fast as it slows down the private sector. When you go back to the 40s, it was a very different environment because most of the money creation in that era was not from bank lending, it was not from corporate bond issuance, it was from large fiscal deficits. And so you had large monetized fiscal deficits. The central bank and the commercial banking system had to buy most of the bonds. So you got that money multiplier effect, but it was very fiscal driven. And the problem is when you have 100% debt to GDP, if you were to raise interest rates, the interest expense that you generate on the public side would be bigger than the amount of reduction you have on the private sector side. And so that's why public debts matter, because eventually if debts get high enough, you go through the looking glass where higher rates no longer have that kind of firm decelerator aspect that they do in kind of lower public debt environments. And instead it's either more mixed, or in some cases, if it's really a balance, it can be an outright accelerator, where the additions to fiscal deficits, which are stimulatory, because all that interest expense, all that spending is someone else's income, that can overweight or overshadow what's happening in the private sector side. And I think we're kind of experiencing that to a certain degree, where we're not at the point where it completely overshadows it, but they're roughly on similar magnitudes now. And so you have a much more muted effect from monetary policy than you would have in the 70s compared to fiscal policy.
Since central banks started printing money in large amounts and on a large scale during the pandemic 3 years ago, inflation has been a repeating theme. Financial experts warned that bad things would happen. They warned again when they started to raise rates in 2022, even though central banks like the US Federal Reserve think the fight against inflation is almost over. Alden says that it's only the beginning. According to the famous macroeconomist, we are in for a decade of rising prices, and central banks don't have the tools they need to deal with it. Here are some more clips from the interview.
I think obfuscation is a kind of a key method there. And so when we go back to, say, 2019, for example, when the repo rate spike happened, you kind of describe it in financial jargon. You say, look, there's a repo problem. And for people that were kind of paying attention, including Luke, about looking at, like the supply over issuance of T-bills versus, reserves and other kind of sources of liquidity, a lot of people were pointing out that they're going to have to start buying T-bills. And then they had to start buying T-bills, and it's like, why are you buying T-bills when you said you were going to be tightening, right? And you said you're going to be shrinking the balance sheet. And they never say, look, we have to kind of monetize fiscal deficits a little bit here. That's not how you phrase it. You phrase it as you're dealing.
It's not QE. It's not QE.
It's not QE. It's just and so that's I think we'll probably see things like that. I mean, for example, fiscal dominance would be less inflationary if it imploded the private sector. So, for example, by raising rates so quickly, they blew out interest expense, but they also killed some of the banks. But when those banks started to fail, instead of letting deposits that are uninsured go bust, they bail out the deposits. And so they kind of soften what happens on the private sector while putting the gas on the public side. And that's where you get fiscal dominance being more inflationary. So it could include things like SLR rules changes, kind of financial jargon that helps banks hold more treasuries, which is also basically what they did in the 1940s. It wasn't just the Fed monetizing all the treasuries; it was other pools of capital, including banks. And banks, because they have fractional reserve, policies, that they can hold quite a bit of treasuries depending on regulations around them, especially if those treasuries are shorter term. And so there's all manner of things they can do. Even things like stable coins are now a new source of treasuries that they can kind of just push out there. From the top level, countries are often trying to de-dollarize now around the margins, whereas the people are often not trying to de-dollarize. You don't see, if you go to the currency markets in Cairo, it's dollars. It's not won. It's not, yen. It's not everything else. It's dollars. And so in a lot of these different countries, stable coins have over 99% of the market share, is dollars, not other currencies. And so that's basically a new source of demand for T-bills. So I think there's a bunch of little levers they can pull to kind of put treasuries in a lot of different places. And I think that's probably going to be the name of the game for quite a while.